I think all of us who grew up playing video games have at least one experience of getting tricked by a shovelware game. Maybe you were drawn in by a cool box art that looked way better than the actual game. Maybe your family member who knows nothing about games bought it for you because they saw you watching the show once. Or maybe you just really love M&Ms. Whatever the reason was, it's not hard to be fooled by these games, and that's why they've been able to thrive and exist for so long. Shovelware has been present in video games since the very beginning. In fact, they were especially prevalent early on because there weren't many resources out there saying what games were good or bad. At the time of E.T. on the Atari 2600, there was no internet to warn you not to buy it. You would just walk into the store, see the sick box art featuring the hottest new movie, and then get home and watch in horror as this graces your television screen. I think a lot of the games released during the Atari 2600 era could classify as shovelware because they usually weren't of the highest quality and rarely reflected anything shown by the box art. As I'm sure many of you know, this lack of quality control led to the video game crash of the early 80s, with consumers being fed up with spending so much money on games that were truly awful. Nintendo was able to save the industry with their NES console alongside industry-defining games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. Of course, this doesn't mean shovelware stopped existing, but for the most part, gamers had smartened up and learned what kinds of games they should probably avoid. On top of that, more resources had become available, such as Nintendo Power, helping to inform people of what games were actually worth their time and money. Once the PS2, GameCube, Xbox, and Dreamcast generation came along, I feel like shovelware had reached somewhat of a low point. Plenty of shovelware was still out there, but it was much easier to spot and successfully avoid. There were more ways than ever to inform yourself of what you were buying with the rise of the internet and the beginning of early gaming media conglomerates. On top of that, long-standing developers and publishers had established themselves as trusted sources at this point, meaning people had learned what company logos were generally associated with good or bad games. Perhaps as a result of consumers smartening up, even many licensed games were pretty good during this era. Games like Battle for Bikini Bottom, Spider-Man 2, and The Warriors helped break the stigma that all licensed games should immediately be considered shovelware. With a better overall quality of games being released, and more gaming informational tools out there helping to save your wallet and sanity, it seemed we were so close to taking down the dreaded shovelware game once and for all. But then, the 7th generation of consoles arrived. The Nintendo Wii catered to casual gamers in a way that no other home console had done before. Its innovative use of motion controls made it easy for anyone to understand and play. Whether you were a traditional gamer, a family with young kids, or a retirement home putting Wii Sports in the game room, the Wii spoke to everyone. This helped lead to its meteoric success, becoming one of the best-selling consoles of all time with just over 100 million units sold. With the Wii drawing in such a casual audience, shovelware games were able to make a huge comeback. After a low point in the previous generation, it now felt like there was more shovelware than ever before. Games would get released that barely even functioned correctly. Licensed games didn't have to try as hard anymore, knowing that the young kids would ask their parents for the games regardless of its quality, and even some big publishers like EA, Ubisoft, or Activision would release absolute slop onto the platform. And I mean, hey, why wouldn't they? There are countless examples of terrible games still managing millions of copies sold on Wii simply because the audience was not informed enough to know what they were buying, or just didn't really care. When Carnival Games can sell 4 million copies, Game Party can sell 2.5 million copies, and Deca Sports can sell well enough to spawn 6 different games in the franchise, I think it's fair to say that Wii consumers weren't super picky. I can't put the entirety of the blame on the Wii though. The Nintendo DS was home to thousands of shovelware games, and when Xbox 360 and PS3 introduced their motion control devices, they were also quickly overrun with shovelware. The 7th generation of consoles just lended itself very well to these kinds of releases. It was a rare generation where every console on the market was super successful, meaning a lot of new, less informed gamers were joining the fold. And on top of that, the focus on motion control this generation was a perfect match for shovelware. Although all of the consoles were successful this generation, and plenty of shovelware games were able to print money, the negatives eventually began to outweigh the positives. By the end of the Wii's life cycle, software sales were dangerously low. If the game box didn't have a Nintendo logo on it, you had to be very wary of what you were buying. This caused a frustration from players similar to what was seen during the Atari 2600 days. And that's a big reason why, despite 100 million people owning a Wii and seemingly every suburban family having a Wii on their TV stand, most people people never actually used the thing. The influx of shovelware games also tanked the reputation of Xbox's Kinect and Sony's PlayStation Move to the point where both companies had to shift away from those brands entirely. It seems that a lesson was learned this generation. While shovelware games could certainly allow for some quick money-making schemes, it would often come back to haunt the developers and the console manufacturers. Perhaps that is why we once again saw shovelware games take a backseat in the following generation. The 8th generation of consoles seemed to be another low point for shovelware. The PS4 and Xbox One consoles didn't try very hard to cater to casual gamers, and so the audience that typically falls for shovelware traps wasn't there. Meanwhile, the casual-friendly console that was on the market was the Wii U, and with that console performing so terribly, there really wasn't any incentive for companies to put games out for it. There were a few other trends happening around this time that I think also helped slow the release of shovelware. The first was several big games hitting the market that catered to younger audiences, such as Fortnite and Roblox. It seems most kids nowadays spend a lot of their time playing games like that, and so a Paw Patrol game, for example, doesn't really pique their interest anymore. And if kids don't even care about your shovelware game, then no one is going to. Another thing that happened during this generation was the continued growth of smartphone gaming. The App Store is a total mess, with literally hundreds of thousands of games that could classify as shovelware. It seems to me like most of the developers who were looking to make a quick buck moved towards the mobile market instead. It's way cheaper, quicker, and easier to get a game up on the App Store than it is to get a physical Xbox game on store shelves. The same could be said for Steam as well. That's another platform that is pretty famous for allowing just about anything, and so that of course lends itself pretty well to shovelware. So far I haven't mentioned the App Store or Steam throughout this discussion because I think the culture of those platforms is just different to that of consoles. People who engage with Steam or the App Store often understand that they need to be a bit more careful about what they give their money to or what they download. There is an expectation that a lot of garbage will litter the platform, but it's a willing trade-off for the developer freedom that comes with it. Consoles, on the other hand, are different. There have always been more restrictions on what makes it through. This was especially true back in the day when every game needed to find a publisher and be given a physical release. But even as we moved into the era of digital console storefronts, there was a decent level of quality control. That's why when a blatant shovelware game such as the notorious meme run on Wii U slipped through the cracks, it was a pretty big moment and it stuck out like a sore thumb. But nowadays, the restrictions on these console storefronts are slipping, and with that, shovelware games have made a roaring comeback. And in my opinion, this new era of shovelware is far more damaging than ever before. When looking at the physical games market for the current generation of consoles, the amount of shovelware is actually pretty low. Of course, some oddities find their way onto the shelves, but for the most part, things are pretty good in that respect. Unfortunately, a brand new kind of shovelware is infesting these platforms, specifically their digital storefronts. One quick scroll through the Switch eShop or PlayStation Store will reveal hundreds, if not thousands, of these low-effort games. You can spot them almost immediately, primarily from their very basic titles and AI-generated images. These games were probably developed within days or even hours and spat onto the storefronts without a second thought. If they can trick just a couple people to buy it, they've probably made money on it. These games are so much more insulting than the typical shovelware we've been discussing so far. Like, sure, Wreck-It Ralph on Wii is a monstrosity, but at least a legitimate dev team tried to make something worthwhile. That team of developers was probably given no time or budget to make the game, and they did the best with the cards they were dealt. And hey, I'm sure some kid out there who loved Wreck-It Ralph was still able to find some enjoyment from it, but these digital shovelware games are different. They have just one reason to exist, and it's to scam people. Within the last few years, the console manufacturers decided to open the floodgates by allowing these kinds of games, and I have no idea why they did that. These games add no value, they are the absolute bottom of the barrel. On top of that, it makes the store a frankly unpleasant experience to browse. And most importantly, it harms the legitimate small developers out there. How are we ever supposed to discover the next great indie game when it's hidden between 7 different supermarket simulator ripoffs? Nintendo's side of things is even weirder as they allow for sexually explicit games to be sold on the eShop. I feel like I'm living in a bizarre world even saying that because Nintendo is typically so conservative when it comes to this kind of thing. But for whatever reason, they allowed it with the Switch, and now the eShop, browsed by millions of children every day, is full of hentai shovelware games. It's far past time for the console manufacturers to crack down on these kinds of games. It's important not to forget the lessons of the past. We saw what happened with the Atari 2600 and the crash of the video games industry. We saw what happened with the dramatic drop in Wii software sales. Is the minuscule amount of money they might be making off these digital shovelware games really worth that risk? Now, I do acknowledge that this is a complicated issue. It can be hard to determine what is or isn't worthy of being available on these storefronts. PlayStation or Nintendo can't deny a game from being sold just because it sucks, I totally get that. And that's why it's easier to have a pretty open policy of what can be sold. But if the game is using obvious AI imagery and is a blatant ripoff of other games that are already available, I just think you have to put your foot down at some point. At the very least, they need to find a way to suppress these kinds of games from being shown so easily. Or how about giving me an option to say I'm not interested, allowing the store to learn what kinds of games my account wants to see. Steam has a system like that, and it works flawlessly in my opinion. And it's for that reason that I don't see a ton of games like this when I scroll through Steam, even though there are probably even more of them available on that platform. Another potential solution would be giving users the option to block certain developers or publishers from appearing on their personal store pages. This would allow people to completely block out certain companies that continually publish the same garbage over and over again. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while I understand it can be hard to restrict these kinds of games entirely, I don't think sitting idly by and letting it happen is an okay solution either. It really is such a shame to see shovelware be able to make such an insane comeback like this. I mean, you know things are bad when I'm sitting here missing the days of shovelware on Wii. At least those games could be fun to play and laugh at how bad they are. Now it's all just AI generated digital slop. I sincerely hope the console manufacturers take a serious look at this in the coming years before digital shovelware damages our console gaming world any further.